Section 13 of Tales of the Uneasy by Violet Hunt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Lisa Reichert. The Tiger Skin, Part 2. Wald Ensor came back to his flat in Ebury Street some time in the early piping dawn and found a cablegram lying in his letter box. It told him of the sudden death of a distant but beloved relation out in California, a man in whose business he had a concern. A day or two later he had arranged his affairs and sailed for the other side. He had found time before he left to forward a bulky package to Miss Adelaide Favarger, containing the skin of a leopard which he had shot himself and of which he had spoken to Adelaide. It went with her somehow, and she had looked flattered when he said so. He had now a very friendly feeling towards her. She seemed to him, on the whole, since their mutual experience, to be a saner, worthier member of the community than before. He did not fancy, when he stepped off this hemisphere, that he was leaving Europe for a very long time, but it was so. He married out in California. He conceived it to be out of pity in some sort, an idea of giving a girl, much buffeted by fortune, a home. But as a matter of fact, Adelaide had awakened the zest of the eternal feminine in a man who had imagined himself to be a confirmed bachelor. The girl was saved, domesticated, but Wald Ensor's attempts at civism and paternity were not blessed in the usual way. After they had been married 5 years, his wife died in giving birth to a child, which died too. Then he drifted, bereft of his casual impetus towards a settled life. His cousin died, leaving him fairly well off. He started several adventures in the world of business, nearly all of which failed, for he had not what is called la main heureuse. With an orange grove that did not pay left on his hands, and nothing else to speak of, he came back to Europe. Temporarily crippled in his resources, he decided to lie low till matters should have righted themselves. He was too proud to take his place in society and go out while his only dress suit was shiny at the knees. He avoided London. He did, however, call in Portland Place, and found new inmates established there, and was told that old Dr. Favarger was dead, and Miss Favarger gone no one knew where, and that she had taken the cook with her. It was in Yorkshire on a market day in Beverley that he met Adelaide again. At first sight she seemed very little altered, only he realized that he had always imagined that she was taller. She was walking with her old staccato step that suggested some congenital weakness, such as a slightly stiffened spine, on the rough cobblestones of the market, about and among the pens and improvised folds that prisoned lowing cows and calves and indifferent sullen bulls. She was not alone. Her companion was a beautiful girl of about 15, a whole head taller than herself. Perhaps that was why he thought her shrunken. There was about her a slight countrified air, which differed greatly from the exaggerated, rather meretricious style in which the old Adelaide had been used to make her points and strive to enhance her own peculiar charm. The two women were absorbed. They were leaning on the well-worn wooden rail that served to pen in the unruly cattle, and watched with interest and attention the movements of a magnificent young bull, which had as nearly as possible succeeded in wrenching his neck free from the clumsy headstall that fixed him to the post. His discontented, inflamed eyes, his stubby, determined shoulder, the dull, passionate intentness on freedom manifested by his attitude seemed to fascinate the elder woman, who was expatiating on his beauties to the seemingly less interested spectator beside her. "Nice beast, isn't he, Phyllis?" she murmured. "Yes, but he'll get his head out in about a minute," the child said nervously. "Then it will be hell let loose," replied the elder woman, evidencing a sort of savage enjoyment in the spectacle of the younger one's timidity. She continued, gloating, "He'd have the whole place cleared in no time. Shall we stay and see the racket?" Her hand stole towards the frayed rope. "No, don't undo it, Addie. Oh, I do believe you're going to." Do let's go home," the child pleaded pettishly. "And Mary must be tired and cold waiting in the car all this time." "Oh, damn Mary," said Adelaide. "Who cares for Mary?" "But I'm tired and cold too." "You are? Come along then, my precious, at once." She turned and faced Wald Ensor. The long last look with which she had enveloped the splendid, sullen, restless animal had not left her humid eyes. Quickly she recognized him and righted herself. She put up to her eyes, with a reminiscence of her town manner, a pin's nest that hung round her neck by a chain of antique workmanship, and said in her hard voice, "Is that you?" Then a marked hesitation seemed to overcome her. She raised her arm that hung languidly down at her side, as if to ward off a blow. A little collection of parcels she was holding together by a string fell to the ground. The child very properly bent to pick them up. Ensor, properly too, was about to forestall her, but a gesture from Adelaide seemed to him to be intended to prevent and forbid him doing so. There was an awkward pause. Then Adelaide, indicating with her pince nez the stooping figure of the beautiful young girl, and looking carefully away, pronounced quickly, "Wald, my daughter, Phyllis." "How do you do?" said Wald Ensor, formally, when, with cheeks reddened with stooping, the child resumed her upright position. She was concerned because one of the parcels was missing. Perhaps it had rolled under the feet of the bull. "Never mind," said her mother fondly. There was a loving pride in her voice. None of the lowing cows, untethered but morally fast anchored to the posts where their calves were firmly bounden, their mother love taken into strict consideration by the cunning drover, who relied on it more surely than any rope that was ever spun of hemp, could boast a tenderer, more maternal solicitude. Ensor was touched. So the restless, theoretic Adelaide was happy and settled at last, her hopes fulfilled, her theories carried out. Phyllis, in her bucolic completeness and obvious sterling health, was a maternal production to be proud of. She had golden hair, blue eyes, and a complexion of roses and again roses. There were hardly any lilies, and although she was lovely at 15, the chances were that she would be rattled at 50. Ensor noticed that the bare hand that clutched the wooden rail was, unlike her mother's, large and heavy. She probably had feet to correspond. The dark bushy eyebrows, which struck a note of savagery in the simple, placidly sensuous countenance, suggested one coarse progenitor. Adelaide's was an excessively refined type. He surmised that she had, in effect, succeeded in capturing something in the nature of a prize fighter for a mate. Such, she had declared, was her ambition to do in the old days at any rate. Something rustic, fair and Saxon. Adelaide released her underlip, which she had drawn in and had bitten till it bled, and spoke quickly, with a graceless, oppressive cordiality that reminded Ensor, at that moment, of the first time she had invited him to dinner in Portland Place. In her access of nervous excitement, as of one constantly expecting to be refused, she was exactly the same, uncertain, deprecating, but peremptory. "Where are you staying, Wald? At the Antelope? Here on business? Well, you can do it from High Walls. We'll motor you in every day. Let us go and get your things out of the Antelope. The car's there, waiting for us." "Thank you. I hardly think I—" So Ensor was saying at intervals, and continued to say. He felt annoyed, hustled, overborne by all the methods of an aggressive, overweening personality. Adelaide's love of domineering had once been modified by youthful languor. Now her masterfulness was reinforced by physical fitness. She had grown out of the delicacy of the young girl, and was, well, a woman to count with. He thought of this as he walked behind her and Phyllis through the thronging marketplace. She talked to him over her shoulders, hardly listening to his objections. They threaded the crowd. Fusty, interested groups were collected round this and that shrewd cheapjack, he extolled in the clearings they willingly made for him, now yards of tawdry lace, now pieces of coarse netting warranted never to tear, now rough crockery warranted never to break. And Ensor could hardly hear Adelaide's unmodulated voice through the clatter of hoofs on the stone causeways, as the clumsy, puzzled animals were run along them at a gallop by sweating, panting stable boys, anxious to exhibit their paces to intending purchasers. Adelaide would stop dead every now and then and become absorbed in the contemplation of melancholy stallions with straw-plaited tails, which stood, their shiny black hocks turned outward, all adown the smooth bits and stone flagging intersecting the rough cobbles. Ensor, to call her attention to his protests, punctuated his remarks at intervals with, "My dear Mrs." She took no notice, and if she heard did not care to supply the name. Now and again Phyllis would turn and smile, a sweet irresponsible smile, at him, and sketch an inviting gesture. Ensor liked all children, and especially girls of that age, and after one of these little demonstrations followed with less travail of the spirit and fewer protests. He rather wanted, too, to see the merry bedamned who was said to be waiting, cold, tired, and neglected in the car. They had reached the outer fringe of booths, the raucous voices of cheap-jacks and the heart-rending moos of the cows faded out of hearing, and the broad street in front of the Antelope Inn, before whose open yard door many conveyances stood, lay before him. He crossed the road and was now faced with the immediate problem of acceptance or refusal of Adelaide's invitation. There was another child in the motor, hunched up and cowering among the rolling swaths of the leather motor hood pushed back. She was obviously cold and tired of waiting. She seemed about 10 years old. Her dull eyes fixed themselves on him stupidly, warily, with a kind of painful animal interest. She did not take them off him. Her white, wide, flat face did not light up in the least when Adelaide approached, and in reply to Ensor's tacit inquiry, said briefly, "No, not mine, the cook's. You remember Gertrude, the cook that couldn't cook? Ha, ha! Didn't you worry me about it? I have Mary here for her health, and I leave her in the car because she's afraid of cows. Now, Phyllis, be quick, go and get the things at stores and come back. It's a fairly long run home, Walt." She busied herself with some rugs. Phyllis departed, saying in a child's flirtatious way, as she obeyed her mother's request, "Now mind you come," while Ensor slavishly entered the hotel, sought his room and gathered up his belongings. The other child seemed to him to have seconded the invitation too, in her own dreamy, spiritless way. It touched him. He fancied he might cheer her up a bit if he could once get her to take to him and gain her confidence. Children liked him. When he came out of the hotel again, Phyllis and the other child were safely stowed away in the back of the car under one rug, pressed up against each other to keep warm. They seemed to get on very well together, Ensor was glad to see. Adelaide invited her guest to take his seat in front beside her, and they started. Adelaide drove in a careless, slapdash way which suggested the hand of little practice. She took risks, she showed ignorance of some fundamental rules of safety. This, however, did not disconcert Ensor at all. He had plenty of physical courage. Full tilt they ran along dull lanes and roads, blackish underfoot, hedge-bordered in a sullen craven green. The plain of York, in all its mediocre dreariness, unrolled itself before them. Adelaide, from between her pursed lips, made no attempt to point out landmarks or objects of interest. There were no interesting features to point out. Dull bryony shoots and clematis tendrils were spread over the hedges like a dusty net coverlet on a lodging-house bed. Neutral tinted nettles carpeted them at the foot. And at due intervals in their extent, clean, neatly made gates shut off the entry into fields, each one like the other. The same kind of stupid, spiritless bird rose up now and again, and lighted on the tedious brown furrow that hid the one behind it. Mean clumps of trees that veiled no possible trysting place bordered the road or looked over it here and there. Ensor heard the little girls behind him whispering and chuckling in the well of the carriage. where they had declined in laughing avoidance of the cold wind that blew steadily over the plain. At least he heard Phyllis's voice and took Mary's for granted. The two seemed to be very good friends. And then Adelaide began to talk to him, in her wire-drawn, inartistic tones which suggested to Ensor something like a rope, lashing, being trailed along a gravel walk. For he longed to bid her to lift it, to try to get taut now and then. The crude passion that smouldered in her eyes only lent an edge to her voice. It always did. When his mind dwelt on the changes in her, he could think of no feature that had altered much in 12 years, except her mouth, which, from having been as nearly as possible straight, had now lost all suggestion of curve, and opening generally in raspishness, closed always in a helpless peevishness. Her face reminded him of the matronly yet at the same time old-maidish faces of those mentally starved, materially satisfied women of the Renaissance he had seen in pictures and reproductions. It was the same drawing over the cheeks, the same anxious slope of the flesh away from the consumptive peaks and hollows of the bones. Her nervous little hands, claw-like, handled the wheel with ill-regulated vigour and obstinate determination to excel. Her vanity amused Ensor, and since it made so decidedly for efficiency, commended itself to him. He liked women to show grit, and did not on the whole object to be managed by any person exhibiting marked competency. As he reckoned, she had to give most of her real attention to the driving of the car. Her vanity stimulated her to attempt to pay off her guest with a conversation composed of ideas long since formulated by herself or others. "Isn't it a grim country?" she said cheerfully. "They say that there are more heirs and heiresses of solitary habit and tottering reason to the square inch here than in any other county in England. You see," she knitted her brows, "these old feudal people have all along paid no attention to physiological rules. They have chosen to intermarry so fearfully." "Your old preoccupation, eh?" said Ensor, smiling. "Don't sneer, Wald. We met and took to each other on that ground, you remember, and I am keener on it than ever. I hate anything of a misbegotten or deformed nature, like death or sin, which indeed it is." She looked at him keenly. "Do you know, if I was not a Christian woman, I should find myself beating Mary here within an inch of her life?" Ensor made a sound indicating his wish and his conviction that it were proper that she should lower her voice. Adelaide accepted the criticism, and to some extent heeded its remonstrance, in the next few words she said. "But as she's poor faithful old Gertrude's unique scion, I stay my hand, and give her instead Parish's food." "It's very good of you," Ensor murmured, oppressed. He remembered the baby in the chest of drawers, and besides, he felt those big, helpless, opaque swimming eyes of the child in the car behind, plumb in the middle of his back. "Dead against my own theories, too," Adelaide went on. "That sort of distinct evidence of a parent's physiological failure ought to be stamped out at birth." "Perhaps," said Ensor slowly and strainedly, "perhaps she is going to be a poet. I fancy Keats had those beautiful, suffering eyes." "Eyes of a sick monkey. Pah!" ejaculated Adelaide brutally, and as loudly as she had ever spoken before. "Let us not think of her. Tell me all about yourself." Wald Ensor obeyed and gave her an account of his doings during the last 12 years. As he talked in that even, rather tame manner, which in him was accentuated, not diminished, by deep feeling, he was conscious all the time of a duel waged within him by two opposing but strong moods. One side of him longed to lay his hand on Adelaide's and get her to stop the car, and allow him to step out of the range of her puissant personality, which alarmed while it interested him. The other side, the explorer-adventurer side, divorced from her image, wanted to stay and see it through, and have another look at the two youthful beings for whom Adelaide was making herself responsible, more especially the cook's ailing child. One long, attenuated, but distinct thread of passionate feeling linked him to her. He had felt like that towards a monkey from a tropical island on the ship that the captain was bringing home to colder climes, and which resented it in sadness and melancholy. With regard to adventure, he could not help wondering if, when they reached a place called High Walls, where Adelaide said she lived, a fond husband would come to the portal and welcome his wife and the stranger she had chosen to bring home. For Adelaide had volunteered no information about herself on that head, and he was too shy, or too apprehensive of difficulties, to ask for any. He only gathered that she was well off and had bought High Walls herself, for Dr. Favarger had left his only daughter everything. Ensor expected, he knew not why, that the car would turn in at some majestic drive bordered by fine old trees. He was the more surprised when, after going for half a mile or so along a bit of road bordered by hedges on one side and a high brick wall on the other, overhung by heavy elm trees, Adelaide stopped the car opposite a small sunk door in this very wall. "I live here," she said. "Wald, will you ring?" Rooks cawed from their nests in the clumps of high trees that seemed to fill all the enclosure, and a dog barked, evidently hearing the noise of the car and anxious to welcome its mistress. Ensor, as he stood in the roadway after having pulled the long iron handle of the bell, had the sense of being at the postern gate of some embattled fortress, standing tall and grimly self-contained in the gloomy plateau of the Wolds. Time passed. No one came to the door. The dog inside barked fitfully. Adelaide's voice sounded unreal in the great spaces, yet she was talking as the people talk in cities. "Nice old place," she was saying jauntily. "I bought it. It went so well with my own peculiar mentality. It belonged to one of the crocky-minded noblemen I told you of. He came to need only one room, somewhere else, and padded, so I got it cheap, freehold and all. It takes delightfully few servants to keep it up, and that's what I like. I hate servants spying. What are mine about? Halloo!" She stood up in the car and called out. Her voice was not good. At last a shuffling old manservant appeared, and stood holding the door, not attempting to make himself useful in any way. It was Ensor who helped Adelaide out. Then he turned to the two children. Phyllis had already leaped out. Ensor looked keenly at the other child, sitting or rather crouching in the wide seat. Their eyes met for a moment. Then Adelaide seemed to intercept them. "Mary, stop in the car." "No, she may as well come round with us," she said fussily. The man got in and took the vehicle off somewhere, and piled with motor rugs, Ensor stumbled after Adelaide and the two children. A narrow path, flagged with stones, not a carriage drive, led up the very short way to the house. On the steps an ugly puppy rushed at them and covered Phyllis with damp paw marks. The child tried to abash and quieten it, in vain. Adelaide, in her unnatural, would-be forcible tones, called it off and bade it come to her. The dog obeyed, but in Ensor's opinion, without enthusiasm. Adelaide seemed to think differently. "You see," she said, "he loves the hand that chastens him. I do the chastening. I have to. All these people are so tender-hearted, except Gertrude. She has good strong hands." "I do hate to hear it howling, Addie," remarked Phyllis. "All young things," said her mother gravely, "need to go through a period of misery and due correction before they are fitted for social purposes. And this is a good dog, or you bet I shouldn't keep him or trouble about him at all. I hate mongrels, human or otherwise. Don't you, Wald?" Her eyes, hardened, embittered in expression, fell on the puny child, who held an immense rug that trailed on the ground beside her. She was evidently too shy or helpless to put it down or act at all until an order was expressly given her. Ensor took the rug from her. She did not look up. He began to think this instance of Adelaide's philanthropic kindness was half-witted. "Go in, Mary," said Adelaide sharply. "Don't stand fiddling there." Someone did thrash the puppy the next day, for Ensor heard it howling loudly beneath his bedroom window. Its cry was for all the world like that of a child that was being beaten. He could not rest in bed through the noise, though he knew well enough that dogs must be trained. He rose and employed the hour or so thus gained on the day to examine carefully the position of the room he was in, its means of exit, etc., in the style of all well-seasoned travellers. He then put on his hat and went out by a back entrance, half stumbling over and apologizing to a small child in a cotton frock who was scrubbing the steps of it. He examined the shape of the house, the extent of the garden, and counted the number of tall elm trees that surrounded it, and were in their turn circumscribed by the high, dull brick wall that gave Adelaide's house its name. High Walls was a composite building, finished in late Georgian period, but including portions dating from almost every period after Elizabeth. The Elizabethan part was more or less built up in the interior. A Georgian architect of the worst years had carefully enclosed and hidden it away, and faced all with a frontage that offended every canon of art and taste, and depressed every eye as well. The high brick wall, Ensor fancied, represented a still more recent addition, for the hideous, expensive portal and colonnade of the façade, which had been evidently designed to dazzle the countryside, was dwarfed and crushed out of all proportion by the encroaching circumference, which ate up both air and space, and gave the house the air of an asylum or a prison. His voyage of discovery ended, he went quietly in by the front door in the middle of the colonnade, and found himself in a shiny-floored hall, carpeted here and there with wild beast-skins, among which he recognized his own handsome present to Miss Adelaide Favarger. One corner of the hall, rendered rather dark in daylight by the pillars of the colonnade, was palisaded off with old German screens, or armchairs that successfully fended off draughts from the front door, and permitted it to be used as a lounge and smoking room. It was panelled with oak and furnished in the old-fashioned regulation country house style, in dark browns and yellows. Several heavy antlered heads of deer hung on the walls. Their sad glassy eyes leered down pensively. He noticed as he went round, pince-nez in hand, that there were some very good engravings, but they all embodied the usual gloating cruelties of the sportsman. There was a print of the fighting deer of Landseer, with antlers interlocked till death, another of the rabbit in the trap, and one of the stag pulled down by its yelping enemies. All these famous works of art were repugnant to Ensor. He was, if he thought about it, inclined to be anti-vivisectionist. On the broad hearth, although it was July, charred logs rested on the iron dogs, and fell slowly away into a bed of soft grey ash, the reduced ghosts of themselves. There was a growing heap of detritus that was never buried or cleared away. The gnawing flame lurked there somewhere at its heart, but gave no warmth, and the man, used to Californian summers, felt chilly and longed to stir the logs, though it was summer, into some semblance of wintry activity. He knew how to behave, however, and taking up an out-of-date local paper that was lying about, he sat down with a patient eye on the main staircase, which he expected his hostess to presently descend. The paper was dull to the uninitiated in local gossip, and he dropped it and began to go over again in his mind the last words that Adelaide had said to him as she ascended that very staircase last night. One small, finely shaped foot was on the stair, with her small housekeeping letter-bag in one hand, the bag he had never seen her without since they came to High Walls. She had held out to him the other hand, saying gravely, without suspicion of vulgar archness, "Good night. Sleep well. I shan't." He had said nothing, disconcerted, but had let her go. He was outraged, not so much by her words as by the look with which she had punctuated them. It made him remember, with an intense, shy, conscious memory, the last time he had seen her eyes, as she had turned to him on the gas-lit doorstep, the eyes of a sick monkey. She had given him the phrase herself. The yellow sofa in its corner at Portland Place, the wide gleaming doorstep again, when placated, reproachless, seeking not to blind him, she had let him out into the dawn. He had begun by admiring her for her fine, non-deprecatory attitude, her bold reliance on the social and moral efficacy of her own standards and principles. She denied nothing, deprecated nothing, dropped nothing. The yellow sofa was there in the hall. He had recognized it overnight, a handsome piece of furniture. He had not supposed that she cared to invest it with sentimental recollections of her old home and her maiden days. Or did she? He brooded over the ways of women, of which he proudly supposed himself to know nothing, when a female servant came through the outer hall, bearing today's paper, which she laid down on the yellow cushions beside him. He had no time to ask her a question as to Adelaide's morning plans, for she quickly passed back again through the red baize door that led, so Ensor imagined, to the kitchen region. She left the door open. A waft of sounds came to him, voices, one of which he fancied was the voice of the famous and omnipotent Gertrude, on whom so far he had never set eyes, while the other he knew to be Adelaide's. She was already down in a foot, then. She was a good housekeeper and gave her orders early? She was evidently holding the handle of the door preparatory to coming through, finishing a sentence which he did not hear. The tone in which Gertrude permitted herself to answer her mistress set him against her. It was raucous, coarsely good-humoured, and her speech, of which he caught fragments here and there, grossly familiar. "With me? You've told Phyllis? Well, that's quick work, I must say." "It's got to be done," Adelaide replied sturdily. He heard her. "And the sooner the better." "The other'll miss her." "That can't be helped. You needn't mind. Phyllis'll profit. This very day, mind." There was a pause. The cook had gone back into the kitchen some little way before she replied, and the vicious emphasis with which she spoke was accentuated by the clang of a dish, roughly set down on some pantry shelf or other. "I don't mind, but it seems a queer sort of way to go and treat your own flesh and blood." Adelaide let the door go sharply, and, bag in hand, came forward to greet her guest. She had not expected to see him already down, and said so. She looked excessively handsome, if a trifle pale, as she pushed her hand through the cloudy swatches of hair that lay across her forehead. With characteristic crankiness she arranged her hair across, not over or back from her forehead. It became her. She stood chatting to her guest, telling him that breakfast was not ready yet, for that lazy little Phyllis, whose business it was to make the tea, had had a fit of temper this morning early and was not dressed yet. While she was speaking, Phyllis looked over the banisters and addressed her mother, calling her by her Christian name, a fashion that Ensor disliked. He fancied that perhaps the child was allowed, nay, enjoined to do so, in order to minimize the effect of her size and the precocious development on the age estimation of her mother, a natural weakness to which Adelaide, like other ladies, was probably prone. "Oh, Addie," the child said appealingly, "mayn't I really have Mary to sleep with me any more?" "No," replied Adelaide. "It is high time Gertrude began to train her. Now, don't worry. It would be poor kindness to keep her any longer with you, spoiling a good servant and unfitting her for her situation. Go in and make tea." Phyllis obeyed sulkily. Ensor was glad to see her put up a good fight for her companion. Adelaide perched with a childish movement on the arm of the sofa, showing a pretty ankle in its open-work stocking. She looked like a handsome, capable gypsy, as she sat there dangling her everlasting bag. "I've been asking Gertrude," she said carelessly, "if she remembers you, and she says she does. You must look her up after breakfast." "But I never saw her," I said, unwillingly remembering her voice so lately heard. "You must mean your cook in Portland Place?" "Not much of a cook, was she? But so faithful, and I needed it. She needed me. She had a lover who was a prize fighter, and he deserted her and left her with that wretched child you've seen, to keep. It is a case of Stavism, I expect, for he was a fine fellow." "Was that she beating the dog this morning?" "Yes. She's got good strong hands." An exultant gleam, an instantaneous flicker, As though by some new unexpected mode of invention, he had been afforded a Kodak view of the suddenly protruded forked tongue of a viper crossed Ensor's excited vision. He shuddered. And Adelaide suddenly, but with an air of intense premeditation, slipped off the arm of the sofa and kissed him. End of section 13. Section 14 of Tales of the Uneasy by Violet Hunt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Lisa Reichert. The Tiger Skin, Part 3. Impelled by the sudden fruition of all that was morbid in his nature, Wald Ensor, towards the end of the year, married Mary Adelaide Francis, the widow of J. Dibben, Esquire. It is a fact that until he bestirred himself to apply for the licence, he had not known the name of the father of Phyllis. Adelaide never refused, but seemed to prefer not to speak of him. Ensor supposed that Dibben, a healthy, ordinary man of no preponderating degree of intellect, had quickly managed to alienate and embitter a capricious, easily bored woman like Adelaide. He was too modest to imagine that he himself amused her, or interested her to any great extent, but at all events he thought she considered him adequate. In his company she appeared to find the nearest approach, for her, to a state of repose. She took possession of him, body and soul. He realized it faintly. She even seemed to have made some slight sacrifice of her individuality with a view to enslaving him completely. Though to everyone else her manner was curt, unpleasant, and at times unbearably arrogant, she stayed her savage tongue and curbed her domineering temper whenever it came to direct contact with her husband. And even had she allowed her natural acerbity full play, the fact that she was now about to become a mother for the second time called forth all Ensor's chivalry and tenderness. He rejoiced greatly at his approaching paternity. The want that had been created deep in his heart by the premature death of his child out in California was about to be completely satisfied. The void that for lack of a better he had filled with Adelaide's child, Phyllis Dibben, he had adopted openly, while secretly Mary, her foster sister, as he in his heart called her, was far dearer to him. Phyllis Dibben was unsympathetic. He did not think hers was altogether a nice nature, but still she was a child, and Ensor's love of children was a real and true sentiment. Though Adelaide and he had met first on the common ground of their philoprogenitive instinct, Ensor had come to suspect that his own was the truer development of it. Adelaide admired healthy, presentable specimens of the class only, and the beauty of Phyllis as an undeniable guarantee of her own eugenical perfection afforded the amount of toll to her vanity, the satisfaction of her pride, that was needed to evoke the motherly in her. It was the only motive that swayed her, Ensor thought. Or else why did she so neglect the cook's unhappy progeny, the child she had begun by petting and more or less treating as her own? He could not forget that he had seen Mary, now degraded to a servant, on the day he had come across her in Beverley, sitting in the car with Adelaide's own child. The turn was too sudden. It outraged his sense of decency. Ensor, whose large heart was capable, where children were concerned, of embracing the halt and the maimed and the eugenically incorrect, could hardly endure to let the question stand over till Adelaide was more fit to deal with it. He constrained himself to do so, however, and contented himself with speaking kindly to the little girl whenever he met her on the stairs or in the corridors. She did not walk, she crawled. He had an idea she was slightly deformed. He realized it was Mary he had stumbled over that first morning as she knelt by a side door into the garden, feebly scouring some stone steps. Her translation from the padded seat of the car to the hard stones she was washing had been so sudden that he could not easily conceive it to be she. After a while he did speak to Adelaide. She made no mystery of it. She was a woman of her word, and Mary's playdays were over. Yes, it was true, she had until then been more or less brought up with Phillis, had shared her room and her meals and walks and games. It had pleased Phillis, but she could not sacrifice a child's whole future even to please Phillis, so now that was over. With a sort of fiendish rationalism and want of consistency, she condemned a child brought up through her caprice, in comparative ease and idleness, to do the rough work of the house, eat inferior food. Worst of all, she subtracted her from all the softening, educative influences to which she had been accustomed. He listened, tapping his boot with his riding whip. He said nothing. He thought it over. If only the child could hold on, it would of course be as well not to worry Adelaide just now, but wait till she had got safely over her forthcoming experience, always a severe mental trial to women of her temperament. Then, surely, milder counsels might prevail. He might get Mary reinstated, a kind of foster sister to Phillis, and that was what he would like best. Oh, very much best, for he had the greatest, the most absurd tenderness for the ugly, sad, unchildish child. But if that were impossible, if her mistress still refused to allow it, Mary might at least be taken out of this and sent away to some bright, well-managed school, or home of her own class, to be properly trained and educated. He did not like the notion of her being brought up to be a servant. She did not look as if she would ever be strong enough. But there were other professions. He would see. Meantime, he did what he could for the child, and that was very little. She never appeared in the better part of the house that the red baize door shut off, and he sometimes fancied that Adelaide disliked to see him cross the threshold of it into the other. Yet the oldest and most interesting part of High Walls lay beyond, and Ensor was something of an antiquary where architecture was concerned. He did not want to annoy his wife, however, and he was careful to conduct his architectural investigations from the back, where the historical portions of the house were situated. There Mary's work lay, and he often spied her at her task of ablution on steps and hearthstones, armed with a pail and a piece of bath brick, feebly scouring, swirling a wet rag about, ineffectually spreading long, spider-like arms in a radius of their length all round her, and producing a dull wet surface, to be succeeded by a bright brown sanded one, where before all was dull, unvisited dust or dirt. She had terribly long arms for a child of her size and age, and she was moreover, he noticed, left-handed like himself. He would stand there for quite a long time looking down on her rusty red ribbon top-knot, knowing that the child was aware of him, but was far too well drilled to look up and crave his notice. How had they managed to transmogrify her so quickly from a sort of foster sister to Phillis, sleeping with Phillis, driving about in the motor with Phillis and her mother, into the submissive drudge who never looked up till he spoke to her, and then with a sad, cowed expression that went to his heart? If she were actually carrying a heavy pail, too heavy for her, or trailing a broom long enough for a person twice her height, he considered he was justified in taking the pail or the broom away from her at once, and trying to learn from her the place where she wished it to be deposited. It was difficult to get her to speak at all, and she got shyer as the days went on. He felt, manlike, that he could scarcely offer to go down on his knees and scrub the stone floor in her stead. But he would have liked to do so, for he realized that it was not a child's work. He fancied that the school board, if they were aware that one of their prey was thus day by day removed from every form of school training, might have something to say about it, and dreaded some sort of exposure for Adelaide. Mary was given no tuition of any kind, he was sure of it. High Walls was 5 miles away from Market Weighton, and though in the nearest hamlet, consisting of a few cottages, there was a school that was half a mile distant, Mary never went beyond the garden, if indeed she got any fresh air at all. The place was curiously self-contained in its girdling walls. Adelaide did her own marketing in the motor. Tradesmen never penetrated within their circumference. As it used to be said of the house in Portland Place, that anything might go on there, so it might be said of High Walls. Adelaide had perhaps chosen to live here, perhaps through some affectionate analogy with the home of her birth and the house in which her mother had died. She had bought High Walls outright, so he learned. She made her own gas, she kept her own fowls and her own cows, and she ordered her clothes from Paris, fetching large wooden boxes that had crossed the seas from the station herself, in the ever-useful motor. In everything she did there was a brusquerie, a jerkiness, a suggestion of eccentricity. There was no doubt that for one reason or another, from austerity, shyness, and love of solitude, or simply from lack of social instinct, Adelaide had succeeded in creating a human vacuum all round her, an area sterilized of gossip. Since their marriage before the registrar 3 months ago, Mrs. Ensor, her husband felt pretty sure, had had no visitors. As a matter of fact, Ensor knew of 3 people who had said they had driven or motored out to High Walls to pay their respects to the lady he had married, but even if they had done so, admittance was probably refused them. These were the wives of men that Ensor had met about in Market Weighton or Beverley, and who had enjoined their women folk to call on the queer, uncivilized woman, whom this gentle, civilized man, that they rather liked, had married. It was easy for Ensor to see that she was not popular. If people even realized her previous existence, they forbore to talk of her. And the call was only a tribute to his own charm and obvious pleasant gentlemanliness. For he was a man's man, a man who women are apt to find dull. But as Adelaide never went out, never returned a call, never expected to be asked anything, it was easy enough to be civil to the husband, and make him free of what there was of society in these sleepy little market towns. Before very long, Wald Ensor belonged to the Conservative Club of Beverley, and was put on the library committee of that active little place, while in Weighton he played golf and adjudged prizes. The wives' drawing-rooms knew him not or hardly at all. He could not very well go about among the women without Adelaide, and he did not choose to do so. He constrained himself to be more or less active in whatever was going, to fulfil his trivial duties as a citizen when they came his way, partly from a sense of duty, partly, he fancied, because the monotony of his existence at High Walls was slowly sapping his vitality, dulling his good temper and sense of good fellowship. The desire to travel again sometimes came over him in a great wave. If it had not been for Phyllis and Adelaide, he said to himself, if it had not been for Mary, he did not say or even think to himself, he would in certain irrepressible moods have proposed it to his wife to leave her for a time. He could not somehow talk to Adelaide now. He thought it was because of her condition. He had come to think that everything, including questioning, plans, and so on, must be deferred until Adelaide, in her own phrase, was through. She thought and talked of nothing else. It was an event of more than ordinary importance to her. Well, it would be over in a few months. Then he would ask her about her social ostracism. He would find out if it was self-incurred, a voluntary effort on her part, or was it a case of sour grapes, and had she been clever enough to make a virtue out of necessity? She was clever enough for anything, of that he was convinced. Or had she, from pique, temper, or caprice, so obstinately refused herself at the beginning, when she had come to settle in Yorkshire, that people had grown tired at last of making overtures of friendship, overtures that were continually repulsed by the sour chatelaine of the lonely house, in its belt of sombre trees and solid deterrent masonry. He could not ask her this now. He could not ask her anything. He literally knew nothing about the woman he had married and taken to his breast, together with her child and her cook and her cook's bastard, with the name that a man unknown had given her, and which he had superseded so easily. He did not know how long she had lived in Yorkshire, why she lived in Yorkshire, and why she had taken a mansion that was little better than a prison, in which they two lived immured. To do her justice, She did not seek to prison him there with her. She made no objection to his leaving her for hours. She would not willingly have minded his leaving her for days, only he never did. He was held by her lazy, picturesque indifference, by the remembrance of the attraction of her bursts of passion in the days when she was not, as now, concentrating every force of her being on one single point, the bearing of a healthy child, a wonderful child, a child that should be even more eugenical than Phyllis. He did not know that he was weak, but he knew that she was strong, and that when he was not loving her, he was afraid of her. Yes, he, Wald Ensor, the man who had shot tigers and braved artillery and dug for gold under circumstances of almost impossible fortitude and endurance, was afraid of this hawk-nosed, straight-lipped woman with the thin wrists, the small feet, and the vanishing waistline. She was ruining him. She was breaking his spirit, making him a craven as in another department. Gertrude the cook, with her good strong hands that he shuddered to look at, was making of Mary, her child, the human being over whom she had power, even as Adelaide his wife had power over him. He was sure of it. With her cruel, if necessary, training, Gertrude was killing her child by inches. In obedience to her mistress's strange wild theory of economics, the warped little body of the cook's child was being maimed and stunted, her mind dwarfed and annulled, her moral and physical growth contravened beyond recall. For Adelaide, with her strong will and sense of duty, was behind Gertrude, driving her to do what she thought was right and correct for the child of humble birth domiciled under her roof. She was right, economically right. It were indeed useless and extravagantly unpractical to bring up the cook's child in luxury, beyond her station. The wrench of unfitness for her inevitable degradation and fall to her true station in life would be all the more severe later on. Only Adelaide's want of imagination, however, could inure her to the thought of such a situation created by her own behest. Adelaide, fond of children? Never. Ensor smiled bitterly under his drooping moustache, and forced himself to remember that Adelaide had the defects of her qualities, and that philoprogenitiveness was not one of them. He had gauged her aright in the old days at Portland Place, or was it that sly, all-seeing old father of hers had sown the doubt in his mind?
Adelaide fond of children? She only thinks she is. Cruelty masked by philanthropy.
And what was that about mother's vanity and its non-negligibility as a factor? He remembered the old man's pawky sneer as he said it.
Cases of baby farming, he had argued. There's sheer cruelty. A woman ill-treats or even kills the child of another. No natural feeling except cruelty can possibly come into play, not even vanity.
Vanity? Yes, there it was, a clear issue. The beautiful Phyllis, her own, petted, cherished. And on the other hand, Mary, deformed, disgraced by nature's hand. He used to hide his head in his hands as he contemplated the terrible antithesis. Get her away. He must, as soon as Adelaide had given birth to the wonderful child that was to be hers and his. That was settled. Meanwhile, he suffered strange, unseasonable torments. Sometimes hanging about in the back of the house, he would see the hem of Mary's frock or the reach of her arm as she scrubbed and lathered and polished. Then with a groan he would prevent himself from turning the corner of yard or outhouse, lest he actually caught sight of the child at some one of her debilitating tasks. He would clench his hands, stuff a great cigar into his mouth, anything to keep him from rushing upon the poor waif, lifting her up, and boldly facing Gertrude, carry her off to America or the Antipodes. One day, feeling he could bear it no longer, he got on his bicycle and rode out to Weighton, on purpose to buy something, toys, sweetmeats, he did not know what, for Mary. Too handsome a present might bring down a beating, he sadly suspected. He had better get her something to eat, something nourishing, something that would disappear. He was about to invest in chocolate fondants, the best, when he suddenly realized that the cook's child had been back in her proper station full 3 months, and would no longer appreciate the kind of eatables that would appeal to Phyllis, who was a gourmet. He asked for and procured the wholesome candy and rode home, tired and depressed. The impulse which had sent him out was a little spent. Poor Mary was the cook's child, after all, bred to servitude, doing only what her mother had done before her. He was a meddling busybody, and would probably only succeed in getting the poor little creature a beating. He was thinking of Adelaide and Phyllis now, of the rich, sensuous beauty of Adelaide's child, and the uncanny handsomeness of his wife. The devilish attraction of it swayed him, always more especially when he was tired and overwrought. It was her eyes. However, he had got the candy, a fat packet that ought to rejoice any normal child's heart, and on arriving home he went boldly into the rear premises, through the red baize door, and asked where Mary was. Gertrude, coarse, homely, but on the whole well favoured, suspended her chopping operations at a board, and raising her chin, regarded him quizzically. With a kind of good-humoured malice, so it appeared to him, she slightly deferred her reply. Then she said calmly, "Mary is in the scullery." Raising her voice, she called, "Mary, you're wanted." Quickly, obediently, a drooping, crestfallen figure of infancy appeared and stood in the sunlight that poured through the doorway, flung from a wide-open window far back in the room she came from. It irradiated the ground she stood on, and the filmy mass of cobwebs over her head. It could not light her up any more than the bogey in the field which flaps lank and dull in the full glare of noontide. And this was a living child, rendered by what means he knew not, unsusceptible, like any scarecrow, of light and joy. The depressed red bow on the top of her head looked as if it had not been untied for weeks. The hem of her skirt was partially torn off. It was far too long for her, and she had fastened, or someone had fastened, it up for her, clumsily with a piece, 2 pieces of string. It showed a dirty pair of knickerbockers. She stood waiting patiently, blinking a little, hideous, shapeless, piteous. Gertrude said nothing, but looked from one to the other, comparing them as it were, enjoying herself quietly, like a rough in the front row of the pit. After a while, as if the play had lasted long enough, she said, "Come here, I'll put a pin in for you." Mary came shuffling up, not unwillingly. She did not seem to dislike her mother. That is all that could be said, and Ensor was glad to be able to think it possible that Gertrude was not always unkind to her. But such shocking neglect, even if there had been no excessive corporal punishment, was culpable. He stood handling the packet of sweets dubiously, while the mother proceeded, with many a shake and pull, to modify her child's disorder, which she had the sense to see injured her, in the opinion of her master, if master he could be called, who had no authority. At last, summoning his courage, Ensor pulled out the packet and put it into Mary's hand. As she stood there, pending the adjustment of clothes that could hardly be called such, so ragged and insufficient were they, the sweets fell to the ground, dropped with strange, unchildish negligence from a nerveless hand. The child did not even look up. A spasm of agony transfixed the heart of Ensor. Gertrude noticed the violent contraction of his features. She picked up the packet of bull's eyes and actually inserted one into Mary's mouth. Ensor did not see if the child retained it, for he was groping on the ground for some of the sweets that had fallen out of the burst packet. "Say thank you, you silly," Gertrude adjured the child, who stood astonished, bewildered by such ordinary attentions as are the usual award of the protected and cherished young of any class. She was passive through fright. But if she had had the spirit, it was easy to see that her one idea was to hide, and that her eyes were looking for a corner to run into. But her mother had hold of her, ordering her attire, shaking her as if she had been a small, frail apple tree.
"That's a very unsuitable length for a child's dress, surely?" Ensor remarked when Mary stood, hardly erect, sheepish but disengaged at last. The peccant undergarments were shoved into their proper place, more or less, and concealed, and her long loose frock was draped into panniers all around her.
"She's skinny, that's what it is," conceded Gertrude. "Nothing won't stay up round her. The dress too long, eh? No wonder. It's one of Phyllis's that Miss Adelaide threw away because it was too bad for her beauty to wear. It had to do for Mary, hadn't it? We can't afford to have clothes made on purpose for us, can we? Now run away and play."
She grinned. Mary stood stock still.
"You're to grow into your clothes, I see," said Ensor helplessly. "Well, make haste and grow. There's a good girl."
Mary smiled. Even if the gentleman's words were absurd and irrelevant, she could not be deceived in the kindness of the speaker's intention. The smile, begun without spirit or brilliance, faded out like sunlight on a wall on a rainy day. Gertrude took up his speech and answered it.
"Grow! Her! Never fear. Mary's one of those stunted from birth ones Miss Adelaide's always talking about. Just look at these thundering long arms."
She extended to its full length the gnome-like skinny limb to which she alluded. The owner suffered this liberty wearily. Her stupid glazed eyes were fixed on Ensor. They seemed to say, "Save me, save me." He stammered out,
"Couldn't she be sent to the sea for a month or so? I would arrange it. That is, if you could spare her."
He waited on the cook's answer agonizedly. She was in effect the child's mother, with absolute power over it for life and death.
"Spare her? Lord, yes," answered the cook calmly. "The work she does isn't worth speaking about. You're nobbut a poor worker, aren't you, Mary?"
She turned to Ensor, away from the child, but she did not trouble to drop her voice at all.
"'Twould be no good, sir. I'm thinking Miss Adelaide's begun her grand training too late."
"What do you mean?" he asked.
"She'll be training her into her grave, that's what she's doing."
"Shh! For God's sake, woman!" he muttered and sought his wife. Something must be done.
End of section 14. Section 15 of Tales of the Uneasy by Violet Hunt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Lisa Reichert. The Tiger Skin, Part 4. He had no authority, except, strange to say, as far as Phyllis was concerned, and though Phyllis's physical upbringing left nothing to be desired, he considered her mental education in some ways to be defective. Adelaide placed no obstacle whatever to his realization of certain views he had formulated and insisted on to the verge of tediousness with regard to the moral standards to be inculcated in a young growing girl. She listened patiently while he exposed these theories, and her thin lips wore something more nearly approaching to a smile at these times than any other, while her husband thus took a practical interest in the future of her daughter. He reasoned broadly and generally. He could not lay his whole mind before the wife of Phyllis's father, for that father counted, and not, in Ensor's idea, favourably. Phyllis had certain strongly marked tendencies which he deplored, and which he conceived her to derive from the parent he did not know. She had undoubtedly a strain of the coarse and the callous. Her father had probably had these characteristics more strongly developed. She had also some disagreeable qualities that he distinguished in and traced from Adelaide, and that careful training might cross and deny and finally eradicate. She was sly, she was morbid, she was headstrong and reckless of the claims of others. So, acting with Adelaide's authority, delegated to him unquestioningly, he kept a strict watch and supervision on the books she read and the conversations she heard or took part in. He did not countenance her frequent visits to the kitchen, and her odd indecent familiarity with Gertrude the cook. He had asked his wife if he might not prohibit the child from entering the servants' quarters altogether, and seal the red baize door that led to them against her use. He would like to forbid all entrance and egress by it, and force her to give her word of honour that she would observe the prohibition. "She may give it, but she won't keep it," said Adelaide lazily. "You can't wonder. She's fond of Gertrude because she gives her titbits. And Phyllis is greedy, poor darling. And then," she looked up in his face, "there's your beloved Mary. She's about, and you must remember the two were brought up together. They were like foster sisters before you came. You altered everything, and now I am going to have your child." He stooped and kissed her, full of premature paternal emotion. Adelaide was supposed to be not quite so well to-day. She was lying on the famous tiger skin that he had given her, and which she had spread over a low, wide couch in the hall. She chose to lie on it always, so that the brute's savage head was close to her own. Loving and akin, the live Adelaide and the dead beast he had given her both reeked of each other. There was all the hot suggestion of the jungle, of careless natural savagery in the juxtaposition of the tiger's snarling teeth, Adelaide's dusky eyes, and the spots and splashes of black that showed on each side of her spare form, like caked, dried blood upon the gold. It was his wife's boast that her beautiful figure was hardly altered by her present condition, and the shocking cruelty to the unborn implied in this attainment of an unnatural shapeliness was lost on the simple fellow who was so soon to be a father. "Our child," he said, kissing her again passionately, "is the thing that matters." Then the recollection of that other child went through, pierced his heart like an arrow. He rose from his knees. All the blood in his body came into his face. He stood looking down at the woman who had returned the passion of his caress with all the force of which she was at present capable. A large patch on the tiger skin, a zebra mark bitten in, zigzagging across the yellow fur, focused his eyes. "Adelaide," he prayed softly, "could we not take Mary back into the house again?" "No," Adelaide said. She spoke quite quietly too, but Ensor knew her. A storm was coming. "Then," he said pleadingly, "could she not be sent away for a bit, or," his immense struggle betrayed itself in his voice, "for good?" "You cannot interfere with Gertrude's business," came plumb and sharp from Adelaide. "If Gertrude likes to leave me, she can of course take her child away with her. But I cannot do without Gertrude, and Gertrude will never leave me. Ask her." She turned away and laid her cheek against the flat head of the tiger. "And I was so happy," she wailed in bitter accents. He knelt down again. Her breath came quick. He feared for her. "It is no use," she said. "You have spoilt it all. And all for the sake of a dirty, misbegotten little wretch whose own mother can't stand her and beats and neglects her. I don't blame Gertrude. Don't you understand, Wald? Mary is one of the wrecklings, one of nature's faults that ought to have been smothered at birth. I wish I had. I wish somebody had. My father would have put her away fast enough if I had asked him, only like a fool I was kind to Gertrude and saw her through with it. But I have come to hate the very sight of the child, and you to come snivelling to me about her, you!" She laughed. Her passion was spent. She looked him, her husband, up and down contemptuously. He murmured, Don't excite yourself." "I won't," she said squarely, turning her face round to the wall. "I'm better now. I won't let you hurt me. I'll even discuss the unwholesome brat if you like. That'll show you I don't care. Get on, talk quietly and tell me what's wrong about Mary's upbringing."
"You are very good," Ensor murmured. "Are you sure it won't upset you?"
"No, I tell you." She sat up and faced him. She pulled a basket of needlework toward her and busied herself with it. Her hands did not shake. Ensor admired her. After all, she had no nerves, and he might as well say his say about the child. get better terms of existence for her, and be done with the subject. He made up his mind he would not say much. He would not descend to particulars of her ill treatment unless Adelaide asked for them. He began gently. "I do think, don't you, that when all's said and done, Mary's young, and even a servant's child ought to have some joy of its life. Mary oughtn't to be made to slave like a grown-up. Hang it all, a simple child should lightly draw its breath, not to the tune of housework and floor-scrubbing. The sight of the poor little kid carrying those heavy pails about makes me quite sick. I should like to tell you what I saw yesterday. Gertrude must be an unnatural mother." "Well, speak out. What did you see?" Adelaide asked sharply. "You were out driving. Mary was standing by one of the high windows in the hall." "She'd no business to be there. Suppose a caller came?" "No callers come. Why don't they, by the way?" "I hate people. I've snubbed them all. They daren't show their noses here. Go on. What was your paragon doing in the hall?" "She was eating something out of an enamel tin platter, such as you feed dogs in, laid out on the sill. The platter was not over clean, and I don't know what the mess was, but it looked most unappetizing, and she seemed to be, yes, actually picking something disgusting, something alive out of it." "Pah! You sicken me!" Adelaide screamed. Ensor went on relentlessly, now that he was wound up. "I put my hand on her little scrubby head with that faded knot of red ribbon on the crown." "I wonder you can touch it. Don't touch me." "And I told her not to eat the nasty stuff, and what was it? She said it was bits Gertrude cut off the toast before it went in the dining room, the same as the dog had. It looked days old, quite mouldy. I shouldn't like to give such a mess to my dog. I can only account for it as a morbid taste of the young growing child, and I bade her throw it away and not eat between meals. It shows the shocking state of health she's in, and she's morbidly inventive, for then she said—" "What did she say?" "That it was her breakfast. 'Nonsense,' I said, but she stuck to it. She seemed cowed, brutalized, but she stuck to it. I say, Adelaide, I know you aren't very fit just now, but oughtn't you to make some inquiries? Does Gertrude beat her or ill-treat her? I hear sounds of a morning sometimes, not so much lately since you've been seedy, but they freeze my blood until I realize that it's the dog getting a licking. Oh, Adelaide, reassure me. Don't you see a man can't stand the suspicion of such a thing in his house? A helpless child." The drops of sweat stood on his forehead. Adelaide spoke, as it were, a prepared speech, which it was now time to make. "Your house!" she said. It was hers, and the man winced. She continued, raising herself a little. "Look here, Mary's a liar as well as a pig. You've owned it. Morbid. Is that all? I say a filthy, beastly liar. And, Wald, I'm going to bear your child. And if you want to have a healthy one, born alive, you haven't had much luck with children, so you say, you had better not worry me. Let me have this chance. I'll never try again. I shall kill myself if this one does not come off. Suppose you be wise in time and leave off meddling in my domestic concerns and go and attend to your own. You've a meeting of the library committee in Beverley at 3. It's full time." She glanced composedly at the watch that lay on her breast, and lay down again as if it were a duty. He went about his business, trying to calm down in the quiet operation of the natural round and the mild form of civic functions that filled his days. Adelaide was right. An important meeting of the library committee was on for today, at which he had announced his intention of speaking, for the subject interested him personally. It was a question of morals as applied to the feast of contemporary literature spread before the youth of Beverley and Weighton. Ensor's contention was that as young girls formed the main contingent of the readers of books in all provincial towns, it behoved far-seeing and right-minded city councillors to see that no works pernicious in quality or deleterious in tone should be delivered over to their private consumption. Their elders, with a taste for life, spiced and otherwise, should purchase outright the literature their souls loved, and leave the shelves of chance to works of limpid purity and unimpeachable, if dreary, moral tone. The library committee was composed of enlightened men and women, for it had been founded by an exceedingly busy and fussy Mrs. Marrable, a bit of a socialist, as she called herself. She was, at any rate, a person professedly open to all the new ideas. The committee were a little afraid of her, and had come to look to Ensor, the shy, silent embodiment of conservative, almost retrograde feeling in their midst, to oppose her. He generally began his sentences, "I know I'm a bit old-fashioned." This was a capital counterblast to Mrs. Marrable and her bit of socialism. They found him invaluable, a sort of slipper on the wheels of frenzied progress, and Mrs. Marrable was not easily gainsaid. She was a relation of the bishop's cousin, and had lived in Beverley for years in a big red house where she entertained Saturday to Monday parties from London. She had no daughters. Another influential member, Canon St. Leger, unmarried and living in the best house in the Close, was a friend of Ensor's, though he had not asked him to come in so much lately. Indeed, looking round the green baize-covered table where all the committee found themselves at last seated, it occurred to Ensor that he had not shaken hands with a single one of his confrères since the last meeting, and that was a month ago. For that reason, he supposed, they seemed strange to him, although they were all, or nearly all, people with whom he had been desired to take pot luck on any occasion, lunch or dinner, when he had ridden in from High Walls on his bicycle and found he had put it too late to get back. All except Mrs. Marrable, with whom for political and temperamental reasons he had always cared to have very little to do. While the committee dealt with some purely financial and business matters, which called for no more attention from the members of the committee than was implied in passing a vote of confidence or holding up hands for a resolution, Ensor wrought himself up into a strange state of nervous apprehension. It might have been mere perverse fancy, but as a matter of fact, not one of these people had spoken to him since they sat down, or recognized his presence except by a nod of salutation, such as the barest courtesy demanded. The attitude of each several person could be accounted for separately. So-and-so had come in late, such a one had too many irons in the fire to be able to spare a word till the meeting was over. But still, there it was, the indefinable uneasiness, the disagreeable insinuating point that morbid imaginings could establish. No one had actually addressed a word to him. He brooded over this. He was tired, overwrought, and annoyed, for the child Phyllis had shown a sad racial cloven foot to-day. He was afraid she was not going to turn out so well as he could have wished. By and by, other business being disposed of, the committee were invited to deal with the question of detailed selection of books for the library. It was a subject on which Ensor was keenly interested, and here he had so much to say that he forgot his preoccupation and did not allow his natural shyness to interfere with the expression of his opinion. He was strongly against the determination of Mrs. Marrable to permit, nay, to encourage, the introduction of a certain novel, the work of one of her literary confrères, into the list of the library. Ensor had had the book sent him from London, so as to acquaint himself with its supposed nature. He had carefully kept it out of the way of his womankind, until, having thoroughly digested it, he threw it into the fire. Yet this book was to be placed on the shelves of the library to which Adelaide subscribed, and a copy of it would be sure to find its way to High Walls. He could not bear the idea of such a girl as Phyllis, eager, sensuous, full of strong, exuberant, readily awakened sex instincts, sucking in the unhealthy, unnecessary knowledge presented so cleverly by this book, and it seemed to his hypochondriacal imaginings that the tendency of the rest of the committee was to override his objections per se. He grew tremendously excited, and the committee wondered to see the usually still and discreet man, who had married the lady they called the terrible Mrs. Dibben, make such a violent exhibition of himself. "I have a nearly grown-up daughter, as you all know," So he ended his speech, and for the moment he felt every inch a father.
"Well, let me tell you that I had rather see her lying dead at my feet than realize that she was taking into her pure mind anything so poisonous, so pernicious, so destructive of all moral health as the work in question. I would rather see her starved, neglected, maimed even, than ruined mentally by such murderous nourishment."
He stopped. He felt that the sense of the meeting was not with him. The silence that swallowed up the last word was hard and disapproving. The chairman, Canon St. Leger, drubbing on his desk with a pencil. Mrs. Marrable divesting herself of her feather boa with the air of one throwing down the gauntlet, and tilting forward her chair, rose. "Do I understand," she said, speaking with privileged indistinctness, but Ensor heard her for all that. "Do I understand from Mr. Ensor's eloquent speech that he cares to throw his shield merely over a member of his own immediate family? What about the stranger within his gates? And I have yet to learn that spiritual injury and moral oppression are the only enemies worth combating? Talk of mental starvation, indeed! Mental! There are worse things than mental starvation. There are blows." She appeared to become hysterical and quite incoherent. "Such hypocrisy, such disgusting hypocrisy, I never heard of. Let him look to his own house, I say. Let him set his own house in order before we put the society onto him." "Mrs. Marrable, I must beg you to observe. This language is impermissible here," Canon St. Leger said, avoiding Ensor's eye and the deprecating gestures he automatically made. "I must call upon you to apologize." "To me," Ensor said, white to his lips. "Oh yes, I'll apologize to the committee," said the lady, "and they'll accept my apology. They all know what I mean. But in the interest of humanity, it is time some steps were taken, and I'll take them." She folded her boa tightly round her neck and passed out. Canon St. Leger swiftly put the retention or refusal of the book in question to the vote, and closed the meeting. Ensor, dazed, his eyes blurred with unaccustomed passion, walked away like a condemned man, condemned for a crime of which he was unwitting. He rode studiously home, meditating on these things to the point of falling off his bicycle. He was stunned with the impact of the undeserved disagreeable, and knew not what to think, or whom to ask for an explanation. And when he got home, he found real trouble awaiting him. Phyllis, who had been ailing rather unaccountably for some time past, had shown definite symptoms of illness during his absence. The little local country doctor, but quite good, had been sent for and had been and gone. He had pronounced the child's uneasiness to be due to a mild attack of typhoid fever. So Adelaide, afoot, her eyes alight with excitement, told the sluggish, depressed man, who dismounted from his bicycle at the door where she came to meet him. "Have something, Wald. You look pale. That meddling brute of a doctor has gone and ordered a nurse, all off his own bat," she fretfully informed him, leading the way into the drawing-room and closing the door. "I was so angry with him when I heard what he had done. Of course, I should have nursed her myself. The woman is here now, so we must make the best of it." Ensor was secretly of opinion that Dr. Hodgson was right, and that the state of Adelaide's nerves would have made her an indifferent nurse. He, however, contented himself with remarking that neither himself nor Dr. Hodgson would approve of her sitting up at night. "But I shall have to, as it is. No nurse can do both, and Wald, I do so detest strangers coming into the house. They go prying about, making up all sorts of absurd conclusions, and telling the ass of a doctor everything." An expression of indefinable apprehension crossed her peevish face, and her husband was touched, taking it as he did as indicating the state of nervous tension she was in. Phyllis's illness, her own condition. He took her limp hand and kissed it. "My poor Adelaide, what have you to fear? There's nothing wrong for him to find out. I don't quite approve of the status of Mary in the house, but after all, that's the cook's affair, not ours. By the way," He was going to tell her something of Mrs. Marrable's insinuations, but concluded he had better not mention the matter at this juncture. He merely asked abruptly, "Where is Mary? I haven't seen her about for the last few days." "Gertrude has sent her away to some friends at Colourcoats, I believe. She asked me if I could spare her." "And of course you did, kind girl," said Ensor. "Oh yes, the work she does isn't worth thinking about. I told Gertrude we should never make a servant of her. Good-bye, I must go to Phyllis. I want to keep an eye on that nurse. I didn't like her face. A mischief maker, if ever there was one." Adelaide was gone, and Ensor fell a-thinking on the painful scene of to-day. He was obsessed, now that it was over, by the recollection of a fluid and retreating committee. He saw black coats and the grey mantelets of the country ladies melting away from him, fleeing from his contact. He could not account for the social ban under which he appeared to lie. This was the culminating incident. He remembered now other slighter acts of neglect and inattention in the past, which he had been too little self-conscious to observe, or to piece together in a pattern of general avoidance and cold shouldering. The arraignment of the woman Marrable did not disturb him so much as the nervous acceptance of it by the canon. Mrs. Marrable was a shrew, a local terror, a person of advanced views, and the author of the book in question was a friend of hers, probably. But Canon St. Leger, a decent, sober-minded man, a man of his own stamp. He saw his thin hand toying with the suspended pencil. He heard again his meek milk-and-water reproof of Mrs. Marrable's unparliamentary language. He could not away with that. He wandered about the garden half the night with the puppy, now fully trained to be a perfect house-dog and companion. It followed him in an orderly manner from covert to covert under the high beetling wall, with the thick beds of nettles growing luxuriantly at the base. Once, however, there was a skirmish. The dog grew quite excited at what must surely have been a not unusual sight for him, the yellow knob of a small boy's head peering over the wall, supported presumably from behind by a human Japanese ladder of other small boys. It was a favourite game in this neighbourhood.
"He, he," they crowed and chuckled. "Who lives here? Old Mother Brownrigg and her girls. He, he. No one ever comes out here alive."
The dog barked and sprang. Fear of his ultimately reaching them at last dislodged the grotesque cohort. Ensor, his nerves a little shaken by this noisy onslaught of words only half heard, turned and made his way back to the house. It was absurd to mind. Children were always climbing up the other side of that wall. It was nice to climb. It had jutting courses of bricks halfway up, and the village curiosity was provoked and stimulated by the air of quasi-mystery which Adelaide chose to foster about high walls, and that her rather witch-like appearance abroad, always heavily, medievally cloaked and motor-veiled, abetted. She dressed like a toadstool in the day, and in the evening like a panther. She strode along, her step was confident, her eyes abstracted, her whole manner carelessly insulting. No wonder the children were afraid of her. He went in and saw the doctor coming out, and questioned him about Phyllis. His anxiety was easily allayed. The big girl was strong enough to resist a whole army of adverse microbes. He saw the new nurse, a tall, thin sprig of a woman with some indication of character. She was very cold and civil, especially when she spoke to Adelaide. He thought he saw plainly that she disliked the mistress of the house already. Another. Poor Adelaide. He knew he was right as the days went on. The two women detested each other, skirmished every time they met, issued cross orders and confused the other servants. But the maid defeated the mistress. Dr. Hodgson, meek little insignificant man that he was, resisted all Mrs. Ensor's hints and manoeuvres, and finally her most palpable efforts to get rid of Nurse Ferrier, who was, on her side, careful to give no positive offence, or commit any domestic crime which might lead to her dismissal on other grounds than medical ones. She was a capital nurse, even Adelaide admitted that, only Phyllis no longer wanted one. Hodgson said she did. He further implied that a nurse stood between Mrs. Ensor and all fatigue or anxiety undesirable for a woman in her state, and that was the only argument Adelaide dared not, or did not care to, gainsay. The distracted woman vented her annoyance at the doctor's tactics on her husband, and to punish him she would not let him see Phyllis. As she spent most of her time in the girl's room, which opened out of her own, Ensor saw very little of her. He found himself not very much cast down by this arrangement. He was much out of sympathy with his wife, a little fretted by her irritability, and was glad to defer their meeting until the need for the nurse's presence, which so enraged her, should have passed away. He wondered sometimes when that would be, and thought he would like to ask the nurse. But she rather sternly, and with a sort of frigidity put on over and above her statutory nurse's manner, passed him in the hall and on the stairs. He began to fancy that Adelaide, moved by her strange taste for regulating the movements and gestures of others, had bidden her to enter as little as possible into conversation with the master of the house. Well, well. He missed Mary, to whom, in the present upheaval, he could have paid a little more attention. Still, presumably, she was well. Adelaide had apparently carried out his expressed wishes for once, and had insisted on Gertrude's sending her child away for sea air. He missed the daily appeal of the dark eyes set in paleness, the weak gestures with her hands, which Mary often used in lieu of speaking, as if mere movement made less stir, and drew down less attention on her from the cruel powers above. Though her face was pale, it was always clean, he remembered. And a queer thing, he never remembered her sitting down. Did she ever sit down? He had seen her squat, he had seen her stand, but he had never seen her sit except that first day in the motor car, when the dark fur cap on her head and the dark fur up to her chin had made her look almost a lady. She was dressed exactly like Phyllis then, he remembered. Strange, monitory caprice of Adelaide's, an instance of her sheer love of power, to raise and then to degrade. No man could do such a thing except perhaps some savage Asiatic king, one in whom caprice remained the only lust left to satisfy. He did not care to affront such scenes as he had gone through at Beverley any more, and he took his name off the committee. He stayed at home, and spent his dreary, uneventful time mostly in wandering about the house, followed by the dog, who had grown attached to him. It generally lay down at his feet in the hall while he sat on one of the yellow chairs, reading papers endlessly, smoking far more than was good for him. Thus he caught the doctor on his way through the outer hall to see Phyllis. The doctor generally nodded kindly, but did not stop. There was nothing to say about Phyllis. She was going on well, and Adelaide did not expect to be confined for a couple of months or so. The nurse flitted by on her screw soles, going up and down stairs, and taking no notice of the solitary man. He never saw Gertrude at all. He was thinking seriously of going away from High Walls for a time, until Phyllis was quite well, and Mary had come back, and he had got as far as the handling of Bradshaw, and the turning of the page marked Continental trains, when one day the nurse chose suddenly to leave the orbit in which she generally travelled, between the red baize door into the servants' quarters and the staircase that led up into Phyllis's sick room, and came straight up to Wald Ensor. The deflection of the moon from her course could not have surprised him more. She spoke. "I beg your pardon, sir, but have I your permission to take Dr. Hodgson to see Mary?" Her eyes drooped and seemed to look down both sides of her nose. With her white cap like a frontlet, her brown hair fluffed out in ascetic waves over her forehead, she was not altogether an unprepossessing woman. She was looking down at him, her lips were coldly pursed, and Ensor felt just as he had felt in the Beverley committee room. "Certainly, nurse," he stammered. "But Mary, is she home?" "She is at home, sir, and in my opinion very unwell." "What is the matter with her? I want to know. Mary is a special pet of mine." The lame, absurd words came broken from his lips. He was not thinking of what he was saying. He was overwhelmed by an avalanche of doubts. Adelaide had lied to him. "Hasn't Mary been away at all?" he stammered. The nurse raised her eyes and gave him one straight, winged glance. She had strong black eyebrows that met across her nose, and a pout that was determined. "She may have been, not that I know of." Her nose was in the air. "Will you see her, sir?" She ended more kindly. "Perhaps you would like to know how she is for yourself." "Yes," he replied, "I should indeed. But I understood she had been sent away to the sea for her health. Let us go. I don't know where she sleeps when she is at home." "You shall see, sir, if you will come with me." Her calmness was only a mask, Ensor felt. Her quiet words covered an indignation that nearly broke through her professional reserve. She was boiling over with rage. She walked through the red baize door with an assured step, never turning or looking round at the shamefaced man, who followed her with humble, downcast head, his morning paper still crumpled up in his hand. The red baize door marked the transition between the oldest and most modern parts of the house. Ensor had never been up the second and original staircase, which led to the attics, and it was these that Nurse Ferrier now proceeded to mount. It was rather dark everywhere, for a heavy shower was impending, the first few drops of which had fallen before they left the part of the house where the windows were bigger. The stairs were uncarpeted, low and uneven. They led up to wide, emaciated corridors, whose panelling was worm-eaten, pale with age and desuetude. Low doors, plumb in the wall, opened into many rooms, at each of which in turn Ensor expected the nurse to stop and enter. Another flight of stairs leading to just such another corridor. The air was faint. It seemed to have been sealed for centuries. Ensor protested, asked some sort of question. Where were they going? "Into the attic, where Mary sleeps alone," the nurse answered. Her manner was more kindly now. "A child to sleep all this way from everybody?" he murmured. She nodded, but did not turn. They reached a short flight of 5 steps built in. Ensor was quite in the dark, until the nurse pushed open a door at the head of the stairs, and they emerged into the twilight of a large bare attic. When his eyes grew accustomed to the light, he realized that it occupied the whole top of the house. "Give me your hand, sir," the nurse said quite gently. "You may get a shock. Mary's here, or was yesterday." The attic was like the aisle of a church, with chapels on both sides. A wide window at the very end allowed a milky track of light to fall along the pale, decayed flooring of the middle. There were small dormer windows in the embrasures formed by old roughly joined beams filled in with whitewashed lath and plaster. Each was like a little room shut off. Towards the centre the flooring was rotted away. The jagged boards seemed to meet in a pattern of interwoven flanges. They walked along it carefully, up to the very end, and Ensor saw the wide stretch of rolling country out of the big window. The nurse went along it carefully, peering into each alcove. She seemed puzzled. "It was this one," she said at last. "It's so dark with the rain I can hardly see, but I was up here yesterday and got scolded for it. Here she is." He stopped. His legs almost refused to move. The child was lying on a large, thin mattress just at his feet. A shawl with ragged fringe covered her, and the dull stained tick of the mattress showed beyond it. There seemed to be no bed linen, and the child's nightdress, which might have been originally of pink flannel, was of a curious, ingrained, dull colour. Ensor started and felt sick. "Ah, sir, you see," the nurse said, and stopped. She bent down. "Mary." She had soft tones as well as harsh ones. The child, who appeared to be dozing, opened her eyes and turned them up at her visitors. She still had her ridiculous top knot straining the hair from her forehead, and the rest of it was matted on her face. Her hand lay open on the shawl, The other was under her cheek. She may have been aware of them. She did not look at these people. Slowly her eyes closed again, and she lay quiet, a grey patch on the dark background of the pallet. "Mary," the nurse said again, "here's Mr. Ensor to see you. Take her up, sir," she bade commandingly. Ensor knelt down and lifted the upper part of the wretched, filthy little body half out of her bed onto one of his knees. As he handled her, he had the sensation of her dry, harsh skin, and it reminded him of parchment. She coughed as he unavoidably jerked her in lifting. By his prompt obedience to her request, he had rehabilitated himself into the nurse's opinion, as she showed by the more familiar tone of her next speech. "Did you ever see such a disreputable nightdress, and such a hole to let a child sleep in?" She went on scolding, and Ensor realized that her abuse was directed at Adelaide, yet it seemed an impossible thing to answer her. She blamed the doers of this deed, but in a strain so incommensurate with the depth of the painful emotions raised in him by the sight of the child's condition. Seeing, however, that he was feeling as he should feel, she respected his wretchedness and spoke gently. "She's been alone so all night. But will you stay with her, sir, while I fetch the doctor? It's just on his time for coming. I may catch him before Mrs. Ensor sees him." She crept away. Ensor heard her gently close the attic door. There was silence, and her heels on the stair, tapping, retreating. Left alone in the attic with a dying child across his knee, the man tried frantically to collect his thoughts. Beyond a little dry, patient cough, made as it were of ashes and dust, which racked her now and then, Mary lay quite still across his knees. He changed his position, and now he sat on the floor beside the mattress. His eyes grew accustomed to the lighting of this place, and he saw that there was a small window in each embrasure, and the one opposite him on the other side of the house had panes. That immediately over Mary's bed was open to the air. The glass had evidently been cracked and had fallen out, leaving jagged pieces in the frame. From one of these there depended the fragments of a checked cotton duster, stuffed in there by someone to ward off, more or less, the draught. End of section 15. Section 16 of Tales of the Uneasy by Violet Hunt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Lisa Reichert. The Tiger Skin, Part 5. The shower was over, and the sun had come out and sent warm rays across the worm-eaten floor, the floor whereon in the old days the feudal servants of the manor house had slept, weary feet to weary feet, fastened in all night by their lord, with no egress save by the little locked door at the foot of the staircase. The lord of old dared not leave his slaves free to murder their taskmaster in his sleep. There may have been at that time about 100 healthy farm-hands, keeping each other warm and their spirits up through the long night with jests and story-telling. Now this enormous garret held but one sickly, fearful, solitary child. Oh! Who had done this? His head swam with dreadful certainties. A great bluebottle flew in at the window and buzzed in and out of the rafters over Mary's head. She was past noticing it, but it irritated Ensor, and he wanted to get up and chase it away. But he could not bear to deposit the child on the filthy palliasse again. The same with a cockroach that made blundering rushes from one joist to another of the decayed ribs of the flooring. There was probably vermin in that bed, and on the child even, but he was past caring. He could not beat his breast, mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, or tear his hair. His hands were tied, occupied with the task they should have set themselves long months agone, the work to which his down-pressed heart had all along instigated him. But in this moment he expiated fully what he described to himself as his rotten carelessness, his wicked easy-going acceptance of Adelaide's excuses, his shameful apathy in the face of the cruel crime that was being enacted in his house. In Adelaide's house, indeed, but the shame was his. Here was a helpless child, dying under his roof of neglect, or worse, and he had had the face to stand before that committee, composed of decent people, and had been puzzled by their quite natural behaviour. They were unfriendly, disgusted, outraged by his pusillanimity, of which they probably had an inkling, or more than an inkling. What about those boys looking over the wall? He had expostulated with the committee for admitting an unpleasant work of fiction into their list, a solecism at worst. He was thinking of Phyllis's morals, whilst Mary starved. He knew now what Mrs. Marrable had meant, that harridan in the right. Dying of neglect and worse. His hand stole towards the open front of the child's nightgown. With sudden resolve he turned her body quite round on his knee, and pushed the garment down to her middle. Yes, the scars that play such an important part in the evidence when these sort of cases come before the court were all there, fresh and old scars, deep and superficial, healed, ill-healed, and suppurating. He turned the body round again and felt Mary's pulse. It seemed to him to be almost non-existent. Another long 10 minutes, savage, agonizing, interminable. He knew nothing about it, but he wished the doctor would come. The nurse had probably not been able to catch him before he saw Phyllis, and had had to wait to waylay him until his official visit was over. And as the child lay across his knee, to all appearances comatose, something grey and loathsome did crawl out from the screwed black hair onto the forehead. He pulled out his handkerchief from his breast coat pocket. He felt no sense of disgust to weaken his efficiency. Such things are. It was all part of the horror that had surely now culminated, and left him seared and stunned, shamed and blighted. The child sighed, and with a pathetic hint of the baby ways that had been scorched and made to perish out of her, crept closer into his embrace. Her sigh may have been one of relief. Ensor fondly hoped it. The blue bottle buzzed. The black beetle looked out again from the crinkled folds of the Daily Telegraph which Ensor had flung down. He did not move. He hardly thought. He was conscious only of the child nestling in his arms, as if he were its new-found father. And a peace was his, a peace he had never known, as if his soul had at last found its billet. When Nurse Ferrier came up at last with the doctor, he smiled. "Do what you can for her, doctor," he said pleadingly. "Why wasn't I called before?" Hodgson began angrily. Nurse Ferrier touched his arm. Ensor saw it. The doctor imperiously pulled the duster out of the window-hole to make more light for himself, and returning, laid the child down on the wretched pallet and methodically examined her. The examination over, he gently pulled the shawl into position so as to cover her, and rose from his knees. "Mr. Ensor, I must see Mrs. Ensor about this," he said gravely. On the way down the narrow flight of stairs, Ensor summoned breath to ask a question. "Is she dying?" "Probably," was the doctor's curt reply, and it was all he would vouchsafe. Adelaide was in the hall and came to meet them. "Where have you been, doctor?" she asked suspiciously. Her eyes fell and rested scornfully on her husband. "Wald, you look pretty bad. Go and get yourself a whisky and soda." "Yes, do," said Hodgson. He turned to Adelaide with a rough dignity of manner. "Mrs. Ensor, it is my duty to tell you both that if that child upstairs dies, I shall refuse a certificate and order an inquest." Wald almost admired Adelaide now for her pluck. A spasm of annoyance, no more, crossed her face, and turning, she led the way across the hall towards her morning room. She said over her shoulder, "She's only shamming. It seems to me you want a drink too, Doctor. That was thunder we heard just now. It's upset you both. Wald, be good enough to send Nurse Ferrier straight to me here. I'm going to sack her." She went into the portion of the hall that was screened off, and seeing that both the men disregarded her gesture of invitation to go further and stayed in the main hall, she shrugged her shoulders and flung herself onto her tiger skin, turning her back, motionless. The doctor looked at Ensor and spoke meditatively. "In Mrs. Ensor's present state," he murmured, "perhaps I had better speak to you, Mr. Ensor?" "Certainly," Ensor said, leading the way into the dining room. "I may say before you speak that I know nothing of this. But that's no matter," he went on. "The blame is mine." He rang the bell. "Ask Gertrude to come to me here," he said to a maid who appeared at the service door at the end. The girl hesitated. She had something in her hand. "What is it? What is it?" Ensor asked testily. "I was going to show the doctor, sir, what Mary had to eat." She held out a plate for their inspection, with some toast rinds and the remains of dripping fat adhering to the sides. In her other hand she held a mug, into which Dr. Hodgson peered. A concoction of tea leaves." "She was fed, sir, worse than a dog," the girl continued volubly. "Biscuits was bought for him. She never complained, not she. Too frightened for that, for if she did she got the stick."
"Who beat her?" Ensor asked furiously.
"Mrs. Ensor, till she got ill. She used to take the poker to her. That's all the marks on her back now. You've seen 'em, doctor?"
Yes, yes. Hold your tongue now,"
Hodgson said. He turned to Ensor, who stood quietly beside him, receiving the unbearable douche of the servant girl's revelations with such fortitude as he was able to muster.
"If the child dies, there will have to be an inquest. I must give the nurse some directions. Where is she? Be off. Back to your work," he bade the kitchen maid, "and ask nurse to come to me."
Nurse Ferrier, quiet, composed, unsmiling, appeared in the doorway, and Ensor scrutinized her face for news as eagerly as if he had not possessed the gift of speech. "Is she dead?" he at last breathed. "No, sir, no," she answered kindly after a pause, recalled as it were from other thoughts. Ensor did not catch the almost imperceptible shake of the doctor's head that came hard upon her words. The nurse continued softly appealing to her chief. "We won't let her die, will we, doctor?" "Not if we can help it," he replied gruffly. "Get yourself a drink, Mr. Ensor, and buck up now. There will be a lot to do presently." Ensor slowly walked away, and the doctor turned to the nurse. "I wouldn't give a farthing for that child's life, you know," he said. "Have you brought her down?" "Yes, she's in the spare bedroom. Mr. Ensor would wish her to have the best of everything, I think." Her long drooping eyes were raised to the doctor's for a moment. She wanted to talk to him, and he knew it, but he did not, at this juncture, care to throw any deductions he might have made, from facts patent to both of them, into the common fund, and he interposed the chill of professional etiquette between himself and her possible confidences. He walked quickly, meditating the while, down the narrow flagged way that led from the house door to the gate in the wall, where his horse was being held for him by James, the half-idiotic manservant, the only male creature, excepting her husband, whom Adelaide would tolerate about the place. To-day, however, expecting as usual to have the whole of the path to himself, the doctor almost hustled a person of quite a different type from James's, a smart, slight, efficient young fellow, slipping briskly up to the house. Hodgson apologized. The stranger, who was dressed in some sort of uniform, looked curiously at him, as if about to speak, but thought better of it and passed on. After some little delay, Gertrude came to her master in the dining room, where he had summoned her. She looked hurried, portentous, but at the same time armed with the indifference of fat people. Her wide apron was covered here and there with spots of gravy or blood. He supposed she had been drawing chickens or killing them. Her bib was pinned up at the corners over her ample bosom. She had no right to have a breast. She had no right to be made like a woman. He loathed her, the agent of Adelaide's system, the janissary who, with fiendish personal lust of cruelty, had brutally carried out his poor wife's unholy theories. And all the while the uncomfortable consciousness was his that, whatever his contempt of Gertrude, it was equalled by her scorn of him. This abominable woman looked down on him. In her eyes lurked the conception of him as something mean and pitiful and likeable. Yes, she awarded him a certain amount of good-humoured commiseration, and she was his cook.
"I couldn't come before," she said sturdily. "I've been up with Phyllis, who's left all alone because of this business. Be done as soon as you can, sir, for I want to get back to the poor child."
"You will tell me before you go, please, how long this has been going on? How long have you been neglecting and ill-treating your own child?" The woman sneered.
"Married, do you mean? Well, you see, Mary all along was only allowed to be here, as you might say, through the kindness of Miss Adelaide, as being her cook's child." She continued, as if repeating a lesson learned by heart. "Miss Adelaide, Mrs. Ensor, has always been very good to me, and I've been the same to her. But it stands to reason that Mrs. Ensor wasn't going to bring up my bastard like a lady. Mary Adelaide, that's her name, had to be trained to be a servant and work for her bread, like her mother's always done, and when she didn't work, she had to be beat."
"And what was the work you set a child of 10 to do?" Ensor asked, striving at calmness.
"Child of 10? She's 15, same as Phyllis. Well, let me see. She cleaned the silver, setting down to it every day, and swept a room, or maybe two, and did down the steps, and her own sewing and mending."
"And what did she have to eat?"
"What the girl showed you," Gertrude said, throwing up her chin in sullen pride of evil-doing. "Scraps what was left over from the day before. That is, if I would remember to give it to her, and she never reminded me. Too soft. Shameful lazy she was, too, and one had to take a stick or a poker to her to make her bustle. 'Whoop! Go 'long!' was all the kind words she got, and a neat cut across her back. She was that lazy, they never had time to heal before there was a new stripe laid over the last one."
"My God! A young child!" He covered his face with his hands. Gertrude regarded him. Some shifting of values took place in her heavy brain. She came a step nearer, and her voice lost its tone of coarse bravado.
"You must know, sir, I had my orders."
"Your orders, woman! Your orders to play the murderess! You, the unnatural mother!"
"You may look a little nearer home for the unnaturalness, if you'll have it. Some folks is very blind, and deaf, too."
"What do you mean?" His tone was violent. The cook said patiently, raising her apron to her face,
"I'll say no more, sir. I must be going."
"Stop!" cried Ensor furiously. "You brute!"
"Call me brute, sir," Gertrude answered almost modestly.
Then her temper rose. She flushed.
"Do you know who's a-waiting for me in my back kitchen where I told him to stop?" she said passionately. "No one won't go away from here, mister," I said, "so long as I give you my word. But I'd something I'd like to say to Mr. Ensor first, before he saw him," I said, "and it would be best for all parties if I could get it said. So he let me come, though he's not a-going back without seeing you." She produced a dirty card from the bosom of her dress and handed it to her master.
The nurse met the doctor on the doorstep when he came back half an hour later. Her manner was instructive as she came forward, her finger on her lip, and he knew what she would tell him. "Mary's gone, doctor, half an hour ago, and Mrs. Ensor has bolted herself into her bedroom and won't answer to anyone. I'm afraid she's bad. And," she dropped her voice, "there's a man shut in the library with Mr. Ensor. Here's what he brought. I found it on the floor of the dining room just now." She produced the card, stained with blood where Gertrude's fingers had grasped it. "Only fowls," she said apologetically. The doctor took it. "The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, Inspector G. W. Kelson," he exclaimed. "That's Mrs. Marrable. She said she was going to put the society onto them." "She's a bit late," the nurse said. "By half an hour," he echoed her as they went in together. "You never heard anything like it," the nurse continued as they proceeded upstairs. "Gertrude the cook has been telling me, and who she is and all. They've just killed her, by inches." "Not by inches, by yards," corrected Dr. Hodgson. He was very indignant. "The child's back is covered with unhealed sores, suppurating. She doesn't weigh more than 48 pounds. 62 she should have. Systemic neglect and outrageous cruelty. They'll have to answer for it." "Mr. Ensor knew nothing of it, I'll swear," the nurse said quickly. "Yes, his wife leads him by the nose," replied Hodgson. "She's a caution," exclaimed the nurse with virulence. "And she'll get off because of her condition. They always admit that." "When it's her own child, doctor? Of course you know it's her own child?" "I suspected it," he said quietly. They had come into the great, wide, lightly papered spare bedroom, with 3 tall windows looking out over the grey gravel sweep in front of the house. The windows were wide open. The gardener could be heard sharpening his old-fashioned instrument, ready for cutting the scrap of lawn beyond the gravel. Professionally, perfunctorily, the doctor looked at and examined what lay on the bed. Then, while the nurse finished her work, he strolled to a window and stared out, waiting to see the master of the house, whose voice could be heard urgently talking in the room immediately below. The nurse, dabbing sponges in hot water, going backwards and forwards with towels, talked. She had not talked for weeks. "The likeness," she said. "Don't you see it strong, now she's dead, doctor? I must say I noticed it the very first moment he came up into the garret, where they had put the poor child away to sleep, or to die, as it happened. Nobody'd been near her for days. Gertrude thought Mrs. Ensor had, and she thought, God knows what she thought." She shuddered. "There wasn't so much as a jug of water there. Mrs. Ensor hoped Mary would die, and Gertrude didn't care. She's a regular bad one. She was cook to Mrs. Ensor before she married, and had a baby there, and Miss Adelaide's father, he was a doctor, and he gave her a certificate of death. He was a wicked old man, by all accounts. So when Miss Adelaide got into trouble, this woman helped her." All the while she talked she was busying herself about the wretched little body of Mary. The doctor stood at his post near the window, waiting for Mr. Ensor's visitor to go, listening to the nurse's talk as he lightly slashed his top boots with his riding whip, and decided what he would do. He liked Ensor, and wanted to make it easy for him. "And," Nurse Ferrier continued, "she says they bought this house with its high walls all round because Miss Adelaide didn't care to be seen about much. She was ashamed, not so much because she had had a baby without being married, but because it was such a wretched little specimen. She called herself Mrs. Dibben. That was the name of Gertrude's man. He was a prize fighter. I make out that he was in prison at the time. Anyway, he was never seen again. Gertrude says they were all going on quite quietly, and the 2 children brought up like sisters. Mrs. Ensor had almost come to think, Gertrude says, that it was the other way about, and that the beautiful child was hers, and the wretched one the cook's. Gertrude didn't care. Her child was the gainer. But that the day Mr. Ensor came, Mrs. Ensor rushed into the kitchen like a mad thing, and said she'd told him Phyllis was hers, and Mary Gertrude's, and that was the way it had to be, for he was coming to live here. Doctor, what do you think of that?" "I think, if it's true, it's a disgusting business. But I don't quite believe it." "I do," said the nurse stoutly. "I am coming to believe it. That woman, Mrs. Ensor, is bad enough for anything, and she simply couldn't have had a nice simple child like Phyllis, not if she tried ever so."
"There, he's gone,"
said Hodgson, leaving the window. He came to the bedside and surveyed the child's small body lying straight, neatly, fairly disposed. The nurse stood proudly away from her work. "She looks nice now, doesn't she, doctor? I've put her on one of Miss Phyllis's smart nightgowns. Gertrude went into Mrs. Ensor's room and got it for me. She's not so bad, you know, Gertrude. She only did as she was told. Mrs. Ensor did the beating and wouldn't let her, positively wouldn't let her give the child nourishing food."
"How is Mrs. Ensor, did you gather?"
"Quite calm, Gertrude says, though she knows everything."
"She's absolutely determined not to let herself have a miscarriage, that's about it," said Hodgson, buttoning his coat. "She's got plenty of self-control and courage of a kind."
"Courage to be cruel!" exclaimed the nurse, glancing at the human piece of wreckage on the bed. "And I should say that if she thinks it necessary to starve her children to death, if they happen to be born weaklings, that the chances are she'll have to kill the next too, even if she does manage to get it born all right. And I have my doubts about that. She's far too keen about it too."
"What's that?"
Hodgson interrupted, cocking his ear. "Mrs. Ensor's door."
"He's gone into her then."
They looked at each other. Ensor, speaking urgently to his wife at the closed door of her room, anxious to impart some intelligence he had just received, could get no reply from her. He did not give it up, but continued to call her by her name, Adelaide. She had a pet name chosen by herself. He remembered it, but he could not bring himself to use it. Half an hour seemed to elapse. He heard a groan. Though he hated her, it frightened him, for there was no one with her. He changed the tenor of his appeals.
"Adelaide, if you are ill, you must not shut yourself up like this. You may do harm to yourself and to your child. If you won't see me, at least let me send Gertrude to you."
Then she spoke.
"Wald, I am not very ill.
Not more ill than I expect to be, for I am going to have a child. It will not be quite yet. As soon as it is born, I shall kill myself, but not till then. So you need not be afraid." Her voice sounded fainter. She had turned away from the door. He was astonished at her self-control. "Not more ill than I expect to be." He felt that he ought to see for himself how she was. Bitterly, dispassionately, he made the attempt.
"Let me see you then," he said gently, "just for one moment."
"Is it to scold me?" Her voice sounded close to the door. "I am not to be scolded now." The key was turned in the lock and he made his way in. His wife stood there on the threshold, half defiant, half apologetic. As he knew Adelaide, the deprecation was much for her. Her beautiful, mournful eyes sought his. They held no cruel gleams, such as had lurked there so lately, when they had talked of Mary. Her dull black silk peignoir was gathered round her. She held it looped pathetically in one thin hand. Yet he was not moved. He only thought of her health, pathologically, as a doctor might. It was his duty. He had neglected his other duty lately. She put up her sharp chin. Her hand let slip the folds of black. They fell all round her, trailing. "Kiss me, Wald," she said.
"No, I cannot."
She turned and moved towards the sofa that stretched across the foot of her bed. Her stumble over the long, embarrassing folds of the garment she wore was a mute reproach, but it could not affect him to the extent of inducing him to comply with her request. She breathed heavily and sat down on the sofa. "See Gertrude, then. She will tell you all you want to know."
"Your cook! Adelaide, tell me yourself." "Oh, why?"
She rocked backwards and forwards and nursed her knees. "I could not bear the sight of her, I tell you," she answered him passionately. "She was a degenerate. She disgraced me. She wasn't fit to live. She ought never to have been born. never even have been conceived. But she shames her father, not me. I am a normal, healthy woman, and all disease is repugnant to me. It's a law that was infringed. She pays the penalty. And to see her going about day by day, the living testimony of unfitness, of beastliness, why, the sight of her peaked, suffering face, old and yellow, she looked like that even in her cradle. From the very first moment that Gertrude showed her to me, that finished me, for I insisted on seeing her at once. I was fit enough. I was about in a week. Then when I came to look closer, her awful hand. Did you know that she had a finger less on her right hand? Still, I nursed her myself. Pho! She put her handkerchief to her bitten lips. There was blood on it when she took it away. Then when you came, I saw you look at her in the car, and again when we got out. And you carried the rugs for her as we walked up the drive. That was enough. I made up my mind then, and I have never repented it. Never, never, I tell you. You would never have married me if you had known, for you would have the same ideas as me. Wald, that's what I liked in you, only I didn't know that you were a coward, a mean, canting, respectable, conventional coward, what they used to call lily-livered, or is it pigeon-livered? Sneer at me if you like, Adelaide, but explain, damn you, explain, he cried, forgetting himself, forgetting her state, forgetting everything under the stress of the terrible, nearly formulated horror. What's there to explain? She said. I hated the child, and I beat her. I beat her to death, that's all. He groaned in helplessness, overcome by her fierce self-sufficiency. But had you no sort of human feeling, no woman's tenderness? You've been a mother. There's surely such a thing as a mother's heart. Adelaide looked at him wearily, shuddering. Been a mother, yes. And you? What about your tenderness, your heart? We used to wonder that your heart didn't tell you when you heard her calling out, screaming, yelling. I beat her, I tell you. I beat her within an inch of her life, filthy, hateful object that I'd brought into the world. Through you. Pah! She flung herself down. Her tone was so piercing, so foreign, so unknown to him, who had learned to expect every variation in Adelaide, that he cried in panic fear merely, For God's sake, keep your head, Adelaide. Don't go mad now on top of it all. Oh, I'm not mad, not a bit of it. Can't you see, you fool? But no, you can't see. You can't see anything unless it's under your nose. It was under your nose, and you worried, and yet you didn't see it. Here you are, Mary's your own child, and mine. Mine. Yours. Don't you remember that night after Tristan? No, I remember nothing. Be quiet now. He held up his hand, as if to ward off a blow. Where is she? My God, I don't know. She fell back. Her pains had begun. He took no notice. I'm going to Mary, he murmured. She rushed forward and bolted the door behind him. The doctor and the nurse were still waiting by the body of Mary. Aware of the portentous visit of Inspector Kelson, Hodgson fancied he might be of some use. He might do Ensor a good turn in allocating much of the blame which the husband was so generously anxious to take on his own shoulders, onto the wife's where it belonged. There were reasons why she should be better able to bear it than he. The law would be merciful to her in her then condition. Hodgson could not fathom her. He was merely an overworked, overdriven country doctor, riding about daily from one case to another. That the maladies of the hardy, normal, if worn-out wives of the labouring classes were of a painful and dreary similarity, and completely relieved him of the necessity of keeping himself up to date with the new departures in medicine, was perhaps the reason that he did not break down from obvious overwork. His old mare, who carried her sleeping master on her back along the same old roads to the same old cottages to attend to Hodge's same wife's 7th baby, was as well preserved as he. A complicated, abnormal case like Mrs. Ensor's, circumstances so dramatic as this affair at High Walls seldom or never came his way, and events in this house had in the last 24 hours succeeded each other with such a bewildering rapidity that he felt himself excused from keeping up too rigid an attitude with the nurse, who, like himself, was humanly and professionally interested, and he permitted himself a certain relaxation in talking to her. Nurse Ferrier, on the other hand, having been shut up in High Walls for many days under the rigorous rule of Adelaide, was enjoying herself thoroughly. All the while that Ensor was closeted with Mrs. Ensor, she continued freely to develop her physiological views, leaving the room only for a moment to get some white flowers to lay upon the child's breast. They heard voices from the next room, and her open, and his professionally concealed, curiosity was wrought up to the highest pitch when suddenly these voices ceased and they heard the click of a latch and a step in the corridor. Then the door of the room they were in was opened with deliberation, and the hero of their surmises and of their sympathy walked into the room. He did not really seem to see them, as they observed afterwards, although he moved his head slightly as he passed the doctor and made what might pass as a grunt of recognition. His politeness survived in the overthrow of all his standards and hopes and ambitions. They stood humbly aside. It was his hour. No one, so far as they knew, had told him that Mary was dead, but he could not help knowing it when his eyes had rested for a moment on what lay on the bed. At a sign from Hodgson, the nurse left the room. The doctor followed her. The two stood in the corridor outside, looking nervously, now at that door of the room they had just vacated, now at that which gave admittance to Mrs. Ensor's apartments, whence came no sound of stirring. 5 minutes later, Wald Ensor came out of the bedroom, carrying the body of the child in his arms very carefully. As he passed his wife's door with his burden, it was opened sharply and as suddenly closed again. Mrs. Ensor had looked out. Hodgson and Ferrier followed Ensor downstairs, wondering what he was going to do, afraid that he had gone suddenly mad and that they would have to interfere. But so far he was perfectly quiet, restrained, and measured in his movements. He walked steadily, balancing what he carried as a nurse does a baby, down into the hall where the autumn fire leaped on the hearth and the charred logs tinkled as they fell. He went through it into the portion railed off with screens and armchairs, and, stooping, deposited the corpse of his child on the tiger skin which lay spread over the sofa, the old yellow sofa from Portland Place. The creases were in the skin that his wife had made when she was lying there only yesterday. Her bag, one of her bags, lay on it, and with a violent gesture of his occupied hand, Ensor swept it off. Then deliberately, as if he were in church, he knelt down beside the little white-robed form, smoothed the folds of the nightgown his hands had disarrayed, and half raising her, taking her in his arms, covered her with kisses, long and deep. He did not lift his head when Gertrude, her apron cast aside, a puzzling figure with her unaccustomed black surfaces displayed, pushed open the red baize door and stood, savagely poised, her bony, flowery arms resting on her hips. "Go back," the doctor said in a loud whisper. Gertrude paid no heed. Her dull, faithful eyes were raised, fixed on something she saw at the head of the staircase. It was her mistress, who was even now descending. The nurse darted forward, and in so doing her dress caught in an accidental nail in one of the screens and made it fall over the end of the couch. Wald Ensor looked up. He kept hold of the child's hand. Adelaide continued to descend. Gertrude went a step to meet her, but Adelaide waved her away. Then Ensor rose, for Adelaide had reached the bottom of the staircase and was coming to him and Mary. She tottered, but she came on. Her husband raised his finger and pointed it at her, and she ceased, trembling, to advance. Gertrude strode up to her and held her shoulder. Her state was obvious. She no longer took pains to conceal it. "Listen, all of you," Ensor was saying, in the same gloomy, intent voice he had used all day. "I pray to Almighty God that this woman may never live to bear another child." He stayed for the inquiry into the death of Mary. He bore himself like a man. Then he left England, and his wife never saw him again. She survived the birth of her child, stillborn. The End. End of section 16. End of Tales of the Uneasy by Violet Hunt.